The first thing I saw that morning wasn't the steel barrier across my bridge. It was the sheriff refusing to let the HOA lock it. That was the moment I knew somebody had finally opened the Wright County file. A dozen residents stood along the riverbank clutching coffee mugs and phones, whispering to each other while a white pickup with the Willow Creek Estates logo idled beside the bridge entrance. Orange traffic cones stretched across the weathered timber deck my father and grandfather had rebuilt nearly 40 years earlier. Standing beside the temporary gate was Denise Holloway, president of the HOA, wearing a cream blazer and dark sunglasses even though the morning sun had barely climbed above the cottonwoods. She held a leather binder against her side, like it contained the final word on property law. Her smile grew wider when she spotted me pulling my old Ford truck onto the gravel shoulder. "Mr. Carter," she called confidently, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You're just in time. This bridge has officially been placed under HOA control until further notice." Behind her, two contractors waited beside a stack of new steel posts and fresh fencing materials. One of them rested a cordless drill on his shoulder, while another studied construction drawings clipped to a clipboard. They looked uncomfortable. They had probably built plenty of fences before. None of them looked eager to build one in front of a sheriff. Deputy Mason shifted his weight near the patrol SUV, but said nothing. That silence caught my attention more than Denise's speech. Deputies rarely stayed quiet unless they knew something wasn't adding up. Denise stepped closer, tapping her binder with one polished fingernail. "The board voted unanimously," she announced. "This bridge serves the community now, and until new access regulations are enforced, nobody crosses without HOA authorization." She said it like ownership could be decided by a neighborhood meeting. I looked past her toward the river flowing beneath the old bridge. The cedar rails still carried the marks my father carved decades ago when we replaced flood-damaged beams together after the spring of 1988. Some people saw lumber and bolts. I saw my family's history. One contractor quietly leaned toward another and whispered something while glancing at the sheriff. The second man folded his blueprint without saying a word. Interesting. They had noticed the same thing I had. The sheriff wasn't helping Denise. He was watching her. My attorney, Claire Bennett, pulled into the turnout behind my truck and stepped out carrying a slim county records folder beneath one arm. She gave me a small nod but didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Denise mistook our silence for surrender. "Go ahead," she told the contractors with a confident wave. "Install the permanent gate." Nobody moved. The sheriff slowly removed his sunglasses, looked directly at Denise, and said, "Before anyone drives another bolt into this bridge, I'd strongly recommend we verify who actually owns it." Nobody reached for the drill. The contractors stood exactly where they were, exchanging uncertain glances while the quiet rush of the river filled the silence Denise Holloway had expected to control. Her confident smile stiffened for only a fraction of a second before returning stronger than ever. "Sheriff," she said smoothly, turning toward him as though she were addressing an employee, "the board has already approved this project. Our legal committee confirmed the bridge falls under community infrastructure guidelines. We'd appreciate your cooperation so construction can begin." Sheriff Dalton didn't answer immediately. He simply looked at the narrow cedar bridge stretching across the water before shifting his attention to the folder tucked beneath Claire Bennett's arm. That tiny movement didn't escape me. It told me exactly what I needed to know. He wasn't interested in HOA paperwork. He was waiting for county records. Denise mistook his patience for agreement. People like Denise often confuse silence with authority. They believed the loudest voice in the conversation automatically became the correct one. It almost never worked that way once deeds entered the discussion. She opened her leather binder and removed several neatly organized pages covered with signatures, board resolutions, and highlighted paragraphs. As president of Willow Creek Estates, she announced loudly enough for the residents gathered behind the barricade to hear every word. "I have both the responsibility and the obligation to ensure safe community access. This bridge has become essential to every homeowner in the subdivision. Therefore, the HOA has every right to regulate its use." A few residents nodded uncertainly. Others looked at the sheriff instead of her. One older gentleman quietly asked whether emergency vehicles would still be allowed across if the gate stayed locked. Denise answered without hesitation. "Naturally. The HOA has already planned for that." Claire finally spoke, her voice calm and measured. "That's an interesting statement. Denise turned toward her with a polite smile that never reached her eyes. And you are? His attorney. Claire replied simply. Denise gave a short laugh. I'm glad he brought legal counsel. It'll save everyone time once they understand the board's authority. I stayed exactly where I was beside my truck. Years of ranch work had taught me something valuable. When someone is determined to convince an audience they're right, interrupting them usually helps their story instead of yours. Better to let them keep talking. Better to let them build the ladder they'll eventually have to climb down. Deputy Mason quietly walked toward one of the bridge posts and studied an old bronze marker fastened near the railing. He brushed away a thin layer of dust with his thumb, reading something stamped into the weathered metal. His eyebrows lifted ever so slightly before he looked toward the sheriff. Neither man said a word. Denise never noticed. She was too busy directing the contractors. Go ahead, she insisted again. We'll replace these old rails first. The foreman looked at the sheriff instead of her. Ma'am, he said carefully, before my crew starts removing anything, we'd really like to know whose name is on the permit for this bridge. The foreman lowered his drill and took one careful step away from the bridge railing. It wasn't fear that stopped him. It was experience. Contractors learn early that replacing lumber is easy. Replacing someone else's property after the county gets involved is not. Denise Holloway let out a short laugh, the kind people use when they believe everyone else is overreacting. Seriously, she said, looking first at the foreman and then at Sheriff Dalton. We're delaying a scheduled improvement because someone suddenly has questions. She flipped another page inside her binder and held it toward the sheriff. The HOA Maintenance Committee approved every phase of this project. Legal reviewed it. Engineering reviewed it. The board voted unanimously. This bridge has served the subdivision for years. Sheriff Dalton glanced at the paperwork, but never reached for it. I'm sure your board approved something, he answered calmly. The only question today is whether they approved work on property they actually own. The words settled over the bridge heavier than the morning humidity. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Residents who had arrived expecting another routine HOA dispute slowly lowered their phones. Even the contractors stopped pretending to organize equipment. Claire Bennett quietly opened the county records folder she had carried from her car. She didn't hand it to anyone yet. Instead, she carefully removed a folded survey map that looked far older than anything inside Denise's polished binder. The edges were yellowed. The ink had faded with time. It looked ordinary. Yet Denise watched it the way people watch a magician reach into an empty hat. That's not relevant, she said quickly. Claire looked at her with the same calm expression she had worn since arriving. Maybe, she replied. Maybe not. I stayed silent. My father always believed paperwork should speak before people did. Growing up, he'd tell me that arguments disappear, but recorded documents stay in the courthouse forever. I remembered sitting beside him at the kitchen table one rainy evening while he carefully filed tax receipts, bridge inspection reports, and maintenance permits into thick cardboard folders. Back then I thought he was simply organized. Standing beside that bridge now, I finally understood he had been preparing for a day he hoped would never come. Deputy Mason walked back from the bronze marker mounted near the bridge. Entrance. Sheriff, he said quietly, you should probably take a look at this. Sheriff Dalton joined him while everyone else watched from several yards away. The deputy pointed toward a line of small engraved lettering hidden beneath decades of weather and river dust. The sheriff brushed the surface with his hand, reading every word without saying anything. His expression didn't change, but when he straightened up, he looked directly at Claire instead of Denise. Counselor, he asked evenly, does your file include the original county permit? Claire gave a small nod. The original permit. Every renewal. Every inspection. And something else I think you'll find interesting. Denise folded her arms and forced another confident smile. Whatever old records you're carrying won't change the fact that this community depends on this bridge. Claire closed the folder gently. You're absolutely right, she said. The entire community depends on it. She paused just long enough for every resident standing behind the barricade to lean in. The problem is, I don't think your board ever realized what that actually means. Claire's words hung over the bridge long after she stopped speaking. Nobody asked another question. Even the contractors kept their hands away from their tools. Denise Holloway looked around at the gathering crowd and realized she was losing something far more valuable than an argument. She was losing certainty. People who had arrived expecting another HOA victory were beginning to wonder why the sheriff still hadn't authorized a single piece of work. Denise recovered quickly. She always did. "Enough with the theatrics," she said, forcing a confident laugh. "Every homeowner here knows this bridge belongs to the community. We've maintained it for years. We've cleared storm debris, scheduled inspections, and paid contractors. That's all the proof anyone needs." Claire never interrupted. Sheriff Dalton never argued. Neither did I. The river flowed quietly beneath the old cedar beams while a light breeze stirred the maple leaves along the bank. Calm has a strange effect on confident people. The louder they become, the quieter everyone else seems. Denise took another step toward the center of the bridge and rested one hand on the weathered railing. "This structure connects 63 homes," she continued. "School buses cross it. Delivery trucks cross it. Utility companies cross it. Emergency responders cross it. Without this bridge, the entire neighborhood comes to a standstill." She smiled as though she had just won the debate herself. In truth, she had just said the one thing Claire had been waiting to hear. My attorney slowly closed the county records folder and tucked it beneath her arm again. "Thank you," she said politely. Denise frowned. "For what?" Claire's answer was almost gentle. "For confirming exactly how important this bridge really is." The sheriff glanced toward me for only a second before looking back at the bridge. That tiny glance told me he was beginning to connect the same pieces I had connected several weeks earlier. He wasn't looking at a neighborhood improvement project anymore. He was looking at a legal dependency. There is a difference, and county records tend to care about that difference more than public opinion ever will. Denise noticed the exchange and immediately stepped between us. "If you're trying to intimidate the board with legal language, it's not going to work." She tapped the wooden railing confidently. "This bridge serves everyone. Nobody is going to shut it down." I finally spoke for the first time since the contractors arrived. My voice stayed calm enough that several people leaned closer just to hear it. "I'm not trying to shut it down." Denise folded her arms. "Then what exactly are you trying to do?" I looked past her toward the line of waiting residents, the delivery van parked near the subdivision entrance, and the county ambulance that had quietly pulled onto the shoulder a few minutes earlier after hearing construction might delay access. Then I answered with the same patience my father always carried when discussing land. "I'm trying to understand why your board never asked who gave all of you permission to depend on a bridge they never actually verified." Nobody spoke after that. For the first time all morning, even Denise looked toward the old county marker, fastened beside the bridge entrance, and something in her expression changed. It wasn't fear. Not yet. It was the uncomfortable realization that perhaps one question had never been asked because everyone assumed they already knew the answer. While everyone stood frozen on the bridge, my mind drifted somewhere far quieter. Long before Willow Creek Estates existed, before luxury homes lined the riverbank and HOA meetings filled community calendars, this crossing was nothing more than two gravel approaches separated by fast-moving water. My grandfather, Samuel Carter, bought the property in 1971 after returning from 22 years of working bridge maintenance for the State Highway Department. Most people looked at the land and saw floodplain. He saw possibility. The nearest public crossing sat almost 11 miles away, and every spring the river cut local farmers, delivery trucks, and emergency vehicles off from the eastern side of the valley. Rather than complain about it, Grandpa decided to solve the problem himself. He spent nearly 3 years applying for permits, hiring engineers, meeting with county inspectors, and saving enough money to build a proper timber bridge that would satisfy every structural requirement the county demanded. My father used to joke that Grandpa knew every county employee by first name before the first beam was ever delivered. Nothing about the project happened quickly. Every bolt, every support piling, every inspection followed the rules because Grandpa believed shortcuts eventually became expensive. The bridge finally opened in the fall of 1975. It wasn't fancy. No decorative stonework. No steel arches. Just heavy cedar timbers, reinforced beams, and enough strength to carry loaded farm equipment across the river year after year. The county never owned it. The state never owned it. It remained exactly what Grandpa intended it to be, a privately owned bridge built to county standards. When my father inherited the property, he treated the bridge the same way he treated the family home. Every spring we inspected every support together. Every fall we replaced worn planks before winter storms arrived. I still remember being 12 years old, kneeling beside him with a bucket of galvanized bolts while he showed me how to tighten every connection evenly instead of rushing from one side to the other. Structures don't fail all at once, he'd tell me. They fail because people ignore small things. At the time, I thought he was talking about bridges. Years later, I realized he was talking about people too. After my father passed away, maintaining the bridge became part of my weekly routine. I never considered it a burden. It was simply what our family had always done. Storms came and went. Floodwaters rose. County inspectors visited every few years, signed their reports, and drove away satisfied. Then the developers arrived. They purchased hundreds of acres on the opposite side of the river and eventually built Willow Creek Estates. During construction, their engineers requested temporary permission to route equipment across my bridge until permanent roads were completed. They asked politely. We signed a written access agreement with clear conditions. Temporary became convenient. Convenient slowly became normal. As more families moved into the subdivision, delivery companies, utility crews, school buses, and eventually emergency responders all continued using the bridge because it was the shortest route available. Nobody ever challenged it. Nobody ever asked who maintained it. They simply assumed something used by everyone must belong to everyone. That assumption lasted nearly 15 years. Then Denise Holloway became HOA president. Looking back, I sometimes wonder whether she ever questioned where the bridge came from before deciding her board had authority over it. Or maybe she never asked because every person around her had accepted the same comfortable story. Either way, standing there that morning while she confidently claimed ownership, I could almost hear my father's voice again. Never assume people remember who built something, he once told me. Keep the paperwork. One day, that's what they'll believe. People often think this story is about a bridge. It never was. The bridge simply gave everyone something they could see. What really mattered was everything it represented. Every Saturday morning for as long as I could remember, my father and I would drive down the gravel lane before sunrise with a thermos of black coffee balanced between us. The river always sounded different depending on the season. Spring carried the roar of melting snow upstream. Summer flowed gently enough to hear fish breaking the surface beneath the cedar beams. In autumn, dry leaves drifted through the current like little boats, and during winter the ice creaked against the pilings before daylight reached the valley. Those mornings became the rhythm of my childhood. We never hurried. Dad believed anything built to last deserved time. We'd stop halfway across the bridge, lean against the railing, and watch the river wake up while bald eagles circled above the cottonwoods. Some mornings we hardly spoke at all. Silence never felt awkward out there. It felt earned. When my wife, Emily, came into my life, the bridge quietly became part of our story too. She loved simple places that carried history. Every anniversary we packed sandwiches, parked my truck beside the western approach, and walked across the bridge before sunset. She used to run her hand along the weathered cedar railing and smile every time she found another mark left by decades of storms. People spend fortunes trying to build something with character, she once told me. This bridge didn't buy its character. It lived it. After she passed away following a long illness, I found myself returning there almost every evening. Not because I enjoyed remembering the difficult years, but because it was one of the few places where grief didn't feel so heavy. The river kept moving no matter what happened. The seasons kept changing. Somehow that reminded me life was supposed to continue, even when it didn't seem possible. I'd sit on an old wooden bench my father built near the entrance, listening to the water while the last sunlight settled across the cedar planks. Some evenings I'd stay 10 minutes. Other evenings I'd lose track of time completely. Nobody bothered me there. It was the closest thing I had to peace. That's why Denise's words that morning never really angered me. They saddened me. She looked at the bridge and saw infrastructure. She saw traffic counts, maintenance budgets, and neighborhood convenience. She measured its value by how many vehicles crossed it every day. I measured it differently. I saw my grandfather's determination, my father's craftsmanship, and my wife's quiet laughter carried across the river by a summer breeze. Those things never appeared on engineering drawings or HOA meeting minutes. They couldn't be assigned a market value or voted on during board meetings. They simply existed because families leave pieces of themselves inside the places they care for. The residents standing behind Denise couldn't have known any of that. Most of them had moved into Willow Creek Estates years after the subdivision was finished. To them, the bridge had always been there, just another part of the neighborhood. I didn't blame them for believing that. What troubled me was something else entirely. Somewhere along the way, the people making decisions had stopped asking how the bridge came to exist in the first place. They accepted convenience as proof of ownership. History doesn't work that way. Neither does property law. Standing beside the river that morning, watching everyone wait for the sheriff to decide what happened next, I couldn't help thinking about something my father once said while tightening an old steel support beneath the bridge. The strongest structures aren't held together by wood or steel, he told me. They're held together by the people willing to protect them long after everyone else forgets why they were built. Looking back, the first warning didn't come from Denise Holloway. It didn't come from the HOA board either. It came from a utility truck parked beside the bridge nearly 3 weeks before that morning. I remember it because I had just finished replacing several weathered deck boards after a summer thunderstorm pushed floating debris against the western supports. The smell of fresh cedar still hung in the air when a white engineering pickup rolled onto the gravel approach. 2 men stepped out wearing reflective safety vests, carrying measuring wheels and survey flags. At first, nothing seemed unusual. County inspectors had visited the bridge every few years since my grandfather built it. But these men never introduced themselves. Instead, they walked onto the bridge, measured the width, photographed the railings, and quietly discussed something while pointing toward the subdivision entrance across the river. When I asked if they needed permission to be there, one of them smiled politely and replied, "We're just updating community infrastructure records." Community infrastructure. The phrase stayed with me long after they drove away. My bridge had never been described that way before. A few days later, I noticed something else. Fresh orange paint appeared on several utility markers near the eastern approach. They hadn't been there the previous week. Then small wooden stakes appeared beyond the guardrail. No county notice. No maintenance schedule. No letter in my mailbox. Just new markings that seemed to arrive overnight. Curious, I stopped by the county engineering office on my way home from town. The clerk searched their maintenance calendar and shook her head. There were no scheduled county bridge projects, no replacement plans, and no active permits involving my property. She even printed the week's public works schedule for me. My bridge wasn't listed anywhere. That should have settled my mind. Instead, it made me even more curious. Someone was measuring a bridge the county wasn't working on. The following weekend, I drove past the Willow Creek Estates clubhouse after picking up supplies from the hardware store. The parking lot was unusually full for a Tuesday afternoon. Through the large front windows, I noticed presentation boards standing near the entrance. One display showed an aerial photograph of the subdivision. Even from the parking lot, I recognized the river winding through the center. More importantly, I recognized the bridge. A thick blue line highlighted it as though it belonged to the neighborhood's future development plans. Before I could get a closer look, Denise walked outside carrying a tablet. She smiled warmly, almost too warmly. "Good afternoon, Mr. Carter," she called. "We're discussing some exciting improvements for the community." I asked whether those improvements involved my bridge. Her smile never changed. "Nothing you need to worry about." Then she quickly changed the subject, asking about the weather and whether the recent storms had caused any flooding. It felt like the sort of conversation people have when they're carefully avoiding the question they don't want to answer. Driving home that afternoon, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had already been decided without me. Individually, each moment seemed harmless. Survey crews, fresh stakes, presentation maps, vague answers. Together, they formed a pattern my father would have recognized immediately. People rarely start measuring property unless they expect to control it someday. I didn't know exactly what Willow Creek Estates was planning yet, but for the first time since the subdivision was built, I found myself unlocking the old filing cabinet in my study and pulling out every document my family had carefully preserved for nearly 50 years. That evening, I carried 3 cardboard archive boxes from the storage room into my study and placed them on the same oak desk my father had used for nearly 30 years. Every folder inside had a handwritten label: tax records, annual inspections, flood repairs, county permits. My father believed papers deserved better care than most people gave them because memories fade while recorded documents do not. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows as I worked through the files one by one. The bridge maintenance reports were exactly where I expected them to be. Every county inspection, every structural review, every permit renewal dating back decades. Nothing unusual. Then I opened the oldest folder in the cabinet. Inside rested the original deed recorded when my grandfather purchased the property in 1971. The paper had yellowed with age, but every page remained perfectly readable. The legal description carefully traced every property boundary, following the riverbank before extending across the bridge corridor and back toward the western pasture. I compared the deed with a modern parcel map I had printed from the county assessor's website. The boundaries matched exactly, not approximately. Exactly. That alone should have ended the question of ownership. Yet something still bothered me. Denise wasn't reckless enough to make public claims without believing she had something supporting her position. Either someone had given the HOA incorrect information, or someone had never checked the original records at all. The next morning, I drove to the county recorder's office. Linda Morales had worked there for almost 25 years, and she recognized me before I reached the counter. After exchanging a few words about the weather, I explained that I wanted every recorded document connected to the eastern subdivision and the bridge crossing. She disappeared into the archive room and returned carrying several oversized survey books along with digital printouts from the county database. We spread everything across one of the large research tables beneath bright fluorescent lights. One subdivision plat after another showed the same thing. Willow Creek Estates ended at the eastern bridge approach. Roads, drainage easements, utility corridors, and common areas were carefully outlined in heavy black lines. But the bridge itself remained outside every recorded HOA boundary. It wasn't shaded as common property. It wasn't transferred to the association. It wasn't dedicated to the county. It simply remained attached to Parcel 17B, the same parcel my family had owned for more than 50 years. Linda studied the maps for several minutes before looking at me over her reading glasses. "That's interesting," she said quietly. "Most people stop after reading the subdivision plat. They never compare it to the original parcel records." I asked whether there had ever been a deed transferring ownership of the bridge after construction. She searched the digital index twice. Then she searched again using my grandfather's name, my father's name, and the subdivision developer's name. Nothing. No transfer. No sale. No dedication. No recorded easement granting the HOA authority to regulate the bridge. Before leaving, I requested certified copies of every relevant document, including the original deed, the recorded surveys, and the subdivision approval maps. Linda carefully stamped each page with the county seal before sliding the stack across the counter. As she did, she paused for a moment and pointed toward one notation buried in the engineering survey that I had almost overlooked. "You might want to read that paragraph very carefully," she said. "Most people miss it because they're focused on the property lines." I thanked her, carried the documents back to my truck, and sat there reading the notation twice. Then a third time. By the time I finished, I understood something Denise Holloway clearly did not. The ownership question wasn't the biggest problem waiting for the HOA. It was only the beginning. I didn't open the certified copies until I got home. My father always believed important documents deserved a quiet room and a clear mind, not the front seat of a pickup truck. I spread the survey maps across the dining room table, weighted the corners with old maintenance binders, and read every page from beginning to end instead of searching for the answer I expected. That habit came from my grandfather. He used to say that mistakes rarely hide in the big print. They hide in the sentence everyone assumes isn't important. Nearly 2 hours passed before I found it. It wasn't buried inside the deed. It wasn't hidden in the subdivision plat either. It appeared in a county engineering memorandum attached to the original development approval nearly 15 years earlier. The paragraph itself wasn't dramatic. In fact, most people would have skipped over it without a second thought. It explained that Willow Creek Estates would receive temporary approval to direct community traffic across the existing private bridge until future transportation improvements became available or separate agreements were recorded. Temporary approval. I read those 2 words again. Then again, my eyes drifted toward the next sentence. The authorization specifically acknowledged that ownership of the bridge remained unchanged. I leaned back in my chair without saying a word. Denise had confidently told everyone the HOA controlled the bridge because it served the neighborhood. The county had recorded something entirely different. Serving the neighborhood and belonging to the neighborhood were not the same thing. They never had been. The more I reviewed the supporting documents, the clearer the picture became. The subdivision developer had never purchased the bridge. The county had never accepted responsibility for it. The HOA had never received a recorded transfer. Instead, everyone had simply continued using it year after year because it was easier than building another crossing. Convenience slowly became assumption. Assumption eventually became confidence. And confidence, when repeated often enough, began sounding like ownership. I could almost understand how the mistake happened. New board members replaced old ones. Developers moved away. Records were stored in filing cabinets nobody opened anymore. Somewhere along the line, someone probably said, "The bridge belongs to the community," and nobody bothered checking whether the courthouse agreed. That discovery answered one question, but created several others. If the HOA didn't own the bridge, why had Denise acted so certain? Why had survey crews measured it? Why were contractors preparing permanent gates? Most importantly, why had their attorney apparently approved the project? I called Claire that evening and asked her to stop by the next morning. She studied every certified copy in complete silence before placing one finger on the engineering memorandum. "This helps us," she said calmly. "A lot." I asked whether it settled the case. She shook her head. No. Her expression stayed thoughtful as she pulled another survey map from the stack and laid it beside the first one. "This proves they don't own the bridge." She paused for a moment before tracing a line that continued beyond the bridge and disappeared into the subdivision. But ownership isn't the biggest issue here. I followed her finger across the map until it reached a notation I hadn't paid much attention to before. Claire looked up at me with the same quiet confidence she had shown on the bridge that morning. "If this second document means what I think it means," she said softly, "they're about to discover a problem far larger than a locked gate." Claire advised me not to contact the HOA again. "Let them make the next move," she said as she carefully returned every certified document to its folder. The more decisions they make without checking the county records, the stronger your position becomes. Waiting has never been easy, but experience had taught me that legal disputes rarely reward the person who speaks first. They reward the person who keeps better records. 3 days passed without a single phone call. Then, just after 8 on Thursday morning, I heard the sound of heavy equipment outside my front porch. Through the kitchen window, I watched 2 contractor trucks pull up beside the western entrance of the bridge. Behind them rolled a trailer carrying a black steel security gate nearly 20 feet long. Denise Holloway stepped out of her white SUV with the same leather binder tucked beneath her arm. This time she wasn't smiling for the neighbors. She looked like someone determined to finish unfinished business. By the time I walked down the gravel lane, several HOA board members had already gathered near the bridge. One of them was fastening laminated notices to wooden posts on both approaches. Another was photographing the installation site while speaking into a phone. Denise greeted me with practiced confidence. "Good morning, Mr. Carter. Since our last discussion, the board has approved additional enforcement measures." She handed me a sealed envelope. Inside was a formal notice printed on HOA letterhead. According to the document, unauthorized access across the bridge would result in daily fines, suspension of community privileges, and legal action for interfering with HOA property improvements. I read every page without reacting. Claire had warned me something like this might happen. Denise watched my expression carefully, probably expecting anger. Instead, I folded the notice neatly and slipped it into my jacket pocket. "Anything else?" I asked. That seemed to disappoint her. She nodded toward another man climbing out of a dark sedan parked behind the contractors. He wore a tailored navy suit and carried a leather briefcase instead of construction tools. "This is Richard Fallon," Denise announced. "Counsel for Willow Creek Estates." Fallon offered a polite handshake. "Mr. Carter," he said professionally, "my client would prefer to resolve this matter without litigation. However, if necessary, we are fully prepared to seek immediate court enforcement." I returned the handshake. "Have you personally reviewed the original county deed?" I asked. He hesitated for only a heartbeat before answering. "I've reviewed the documents provided by the association." That wasn't the answer I asked for. Claire arrived a few minutes later and quietly joined me without interrupting. Fallon acknowledged her with a courteous nod before Denise spoke again. "Construction begins today." She turned toward the contractors. "Install the gate." The foreman took one cautious step forward but stopped almost immediately. "Ma'am," he said, looking first at Fallon and then toward Claire. "Our insurance carrier asked whether ownership has been confirmed." Denise's patience finally cracked. It has been confirmed by the board. That's not what I asked, the foreman replied. Before Denise could answer, another pickup truck rolled onto the gravel road. A county code enforcement officer stepped out carrying a clipboard. Moments later, a second vehicle arrived from the sheriff's office. Deputy Mason climbed out, glanced at the unopened steel gate lying on the trailer, then at the formal notices hanging beside the bridge. Without saying a word, he removed one of the notices from the post and began reading it very carefully. Denise still believed she controlled the situation. She never noticed that nobody else was looking at her anymore. They were all waiting to hear what the county intended to say next. Deputy Mason finished reading the HOA notice before handing it to the county code enforcement officer beside him. Neither man commented immediately. Denise Holloway seemed almost pleased by their silence. She folded her arms and looked toward the small crowd gathering along the roadside. As you can see, she announced confidently, the association has completed every legal requirement necessary to protect community access. The words echoed across the river. Claire remained perfectly still beside me, holding the county folder against her side. She never corrected Denise. She never argued. That alone made me believe she had already seen something the rest of us hadn't. The county officer finally looked up from the notice. Mrs. Holloway, he asked politely, does your board understand why this bridge was allowed to serve the subdivision in the first place? Denise smiled. Because it's the primary entrance for our residents. That's how it's used, he replied. That isn't what I asked. She frowned slightly, but answered anyway. The developer designed it that way. The officer slowly shook his head. No, the developer requested permission to use it that way. There was a difference. A very important difference. Claire quietly opened the folder and removed the engineering memorandum Linda Morales had pointed out at the recorder's office. She handed it to the county officer without saying a word. He read the highlighted paragraph, nodded once, and then unfolded another survey map from inside his own clipboard. Unlike the property plats I had already reviewed, this map extended well beyond the subdivision boundaries. Colored lines traced utility corridors, emergency response routes, and public service access throughout the valley. One thick red line crossed directly over my family's bridge before branching into every street inside Willow Creek Estates. The officer rested one finger on the map. This is the county's emergency access designation. Several residents stepped closer to see it. Fire engines use this route. Ambulances use this route. Sheriff's deputies use this route. Utility restoration crews use this route after storms. Denise interrupted quickly. Exactly. That's why the HOA has to regulate it. No, the officer answered calmly. That's why the county approved this access arrangement years ago as part of the subdivision approval. The conversation grew noticeably quieter. Even the contractors stopped pretending to organize their equipment. The officer continued tracing the red line across the map. When the subdivision was approved, the county accepted this route as the designated emergency access corridor. Denise's confidence faded for only a moment before returning. That changes nothing, she insisted. The community still depends on it. Claire finally spoke. You're right. Denise looked relieved. Then Claire finished her sentence. The entire community depends on it. She gently placed the original engineering memorandum beside the county map so both documents could be viewed together. Which means every decision your board has made this week affects far more than bridge traffic. Denise stared at the two documents without speaking. For the first time since this dispute began, she wasn't looking at me. She wasn't looking at the sheriff either. She was looking at a single notation printed near the bottom of the county survey. I had overlooked it the first time I read the file. She hadn't seen it until that moment. And judging by the color slowly leaving her face, she finally understood that the bridge itself had never been the county's biggest concern. Nobody spoke for several long seconds. The only sound came from the river slipping beneath the cedar beams and the occasional creak of the old bridge settling under its own weight. Denise Holloway continued staring at the county map as though reading it a second time might somehow change what it said. It didn't. Sheriff Dalton quietly removed his notebook from his uniform pocket and began writing. He wasn't taking sides. He was documenting facts. That alone made the atmosphere feel different. Denise finally looked toward Richard Fallon. Tell them, she said, her confidence no longer quite as steady. Tell them the board acted within its authority. Fallon adjusted his glasses and reached for the engineering memorandum Claire had placed on the hood of the sheriff's SUV. Unlike Denise, he actually read every paragraph from beginning to end. He didn't rush. He compared the memorandum with the subdivision plat, then with the county emergency access map. When he finished, he closed the folder without saying a word. That silence answered more questions than any legal argument could have. Denise waited impatiently. "Richard," he chose his words carefully, "I'd like a few minutes to speak with the board privately." Denise shook her head. "There's nothing to discuss. They're trying to intimidate us with paperwork." Fallon remained calm. "Paperwork is exactly what courts rely on." Claire stood beside me without interrupting. She had predicted this moment almost a week earlier when she told me to let the HOA keep making decisions. Every notice they posted, every contractor they hired, every order they issued without confirming the county records had quietly built the case against them. Sheriff Dalton closed his notebook. "Mrs. Holloway," he said evenly, "before anyone installs that gate, I'm requesting that all work stop until ownership and legal authority are fully verified." Denise immediately protested. "You can't suspend a lawful HOA project." "I'm not suspending it," the sheriff replied. "Your own attorney appears to be reconsidering it." Every resident turned toward Fallon. He remained silent for another moment before addressing Denise directly. "Did the board ever request a certified title review?" She hesitated. "We reviewed the subdivision documents." "That's not what I asked." Fallon looked toward Claire. "Counselor, would you be willing to provide certified copies of the original deed and county engineering approvals?" Claire handed him the folder without hesitation. He flipped through the documents one final time before exhaling quietly. "I believe the association needs to postpone all enforcement actions immediately." Denise stared at him in disbelief. "Postpone?" Fallon nodded. "Remove the violation notices. Cancel the gate installation. Suspend every complaint filed against Mr. Carter until this matter is fully resolved." The contractors immediately began securing their equipment instead of unloading it. One board member quietly removed the laminated notices from the bridge entrance, while another folded the unopened steel gate back onto the trailer. Nobody had ordered them to do it. They simply recognized where the conversation was heading. Sheriff Dalton watched everything without expression before looking at Claire. "Counselor," he said, "I have a feeling we're still missing one piece of this puzzle." Claire closed the now empty folder and gave a slight nod. "We are." She glanced once toward the bridge, then toward the subdivision beyond it. "Because ownership explains who built the bridge." She paused just long enough for everyone to follow her gaze. "It doesn't explain what happens if the owner decides to exercise every legal right that comes with it." Claire let the silence settle before speaking again. She wasn't building suspense for effect. She was giving everyone a chance to understand that the conversation had just shifted from ownership to consequences. "Sheriff," she said, laying one final certified document on the hood of the patrol SUV. "This is the recorded access and emergency services agreement filed with the county the same week Willow Creek Estates received final development approval." Richard Fallon immediately leaned forward to read it. Denise stepped beside him, her confidence fading with every line. The agreement wasn't hidden. It had been sitting in the county archives for nearly 15 years, recorded under the original development file instead of the HOA records. That simple filing choice explained why nobody on the current board had ever mentioned it. They had never looked in the right place. Claire pointed to the first highlighted paragraph. "The owner of Parcel 17B grants the county, emergency responders, school transportation, utility providers, and authorized public service vehicles permission to cross the privately owned bridge." Denise interrupted. "Exactly. That's what we've been saying." Claire calmly continued reading without acknowledging the interruption. "This agreement shall not transfer ownership, management authority, maintenance authority, or regulatory authority to the developer, homeowners association, or any successor organization." Richard Fallon's expression changed immediately. Denise's did not. Not yet. She was still trying to fit the words into the story she had believed for months. Claire turned to the final page. Now read section 9. Fallon read it silently, then looked up at me. "I don't believe this." Claire nodded. "It's properly recorded." Sheriff Dalton held out his hand, and Fallon passed him the document. The sheriff read the same paragraph twice before quietly closing the file. "Mrs. Holloway," he said, "did your board ever receive legal Advice regarding this section? Denise looked at Fallon. He answered honestly, no, because the board never provided this agreement for review. Claire finally explained what everyone else was beginning to realize. The county approved Willow Creek Estates because Mr. Carter's father voluntarily entered into this agreement. His family allowed emergency vehicles, school buses, utility crews, and county services to use the bridge without giving up ownership or control. The bridge remained private. The access remained licensed, not transferred. She paused before continuing. That license also contains one additional condition. She pointed to the final paragraph. Should the property owner experience material interference with ownership rights, unauthorized regulation, obstruction, or unlawful attempts to assume control of the bridge, the owner reserves the right to immediately suspend all non-emergency licensed access until the violation is corrected. Nobody moved. Denise slowly turned toward the bridge as if seeing it for the first time. Claire's voice remained calm. Emergency vehicles always retain access. The county protected that. But delivery companies, contractors, service providers, landscaping crews, moving trucks, commercial vendors, and every other licensed non-emergency user cross this bridge only because Mr. Carter's family has voluntarily allowed it for decades. Fallon removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. If the association unlawfully interfered with the owner's rights. Claire finished the sentence for him. Then the owner is legally entitled to suspend every licensed privilege the HOA has taken for granted until the interference ends. Sheriff Dalton closed the agreement and looked directly at Denise. Which means your board never had the authority to lock this bridge. He paused, letting the words settle over the gathered residents. But by attempting to do so, you may have triggered the one legal protection your association should have hoped never to activate. Word spread through Willow Creek Estates faster than I expected. Before noon, residents began arriving from every corner of the subdivision. Some came because they had heard the sheriff was involved. Others came because someone had mentioned county officials. By lunchtime, both sides of the bridge were lined with pickup trucks, family SUVs, and curious homeowners quietly asking one another what had happened. Nobody seemed interested in Denise Holloway's explanations anymore. They were all watching the people holding official county folders. A county attorney arrived shortly after 11, carrying a leather briefcase and several certified copies of the development records. Later that afternoon, the circuit judge assigned to hear the emergency property matter issued a temporary restraining order after reviewing the certified county records submitted by both attorneys. There was no dramatic courtroom battle. There didn't need to be. Every critical document had been filed years earlier. Facts rarely become more persuasive simply because they're repeated louder. Sheriff Dalton received the signed order electronically, reviewed it alongside the county attorney, then walked calmly toward the center of the bridge where Denise and the remaining board members still stood beside the unopened security gate. Deputy Mason and another deputy quietly followed several steps behind him. The crowd became completely silent. Sheriff Dalton handed Denise a copy of the order. Mrs. Holloway, he said evenly, the court has directed the association to immediately cease all attempts to regulate, restrict, or obstruct this privately owned bridge. Denise scanned the first page before shaking her head. This can't be right. The county attorney answered before the sheriff could. It is correct. The court recognizes the recorded ownership, the original access agreement, and the owner's reserved rights exactly as filed. Denise looked toward Richard Fallon, hoping for disagreement. Instead, he simply lowered his eyes. The county records are controlling, he said quietly. The court has no reason to reach a different conclusion. A murmur spread through the residents standing behind the barricades. People who had trusted every HOA newsletter and board announcement suddenly realized they had never been shown the documents that actually mattered. One homeowner quietly asked another whether the board had really tried to claim property they didn't own. Nobody answered. They didn't have to. Sheriff Dalton continued reading from the order. The association is further directed to remove every notice, barrier, restriction, and unauthorized claim of control placed upon the bridge. He looked toward the unopened steel gate still resting on the contractor's trailer. That installation will not proceed. The foreman immediately instructed his crew to disconnect the lifting chains. Within minutes, the gate that had been delivered to symbolize HOA authority was being loaded back onto the trailer without ever touching the bridge. Residents watched the entire process in complete silence. Denise tried one final time. The community still depends on this bridge. Claire stepped forward beside me. No one has ever disputed that. She looked toward the families gathered along the roadside. Mr. Carter's family has allowed this community to use the bridge for nearly 15 years because they believed good neighbors help one another. She paused before continuing. The only reason that privilege was ever placed at risk was because your board attempted to take control of something that had never belonged to it. The county attorney nodded in agreement. The owner's licensed access remains fully intact because he has chosen not to suspend it. Several residents turned toward me with expressions that looked far different from the confident smiles I'd seen earlier that morning. One elderly couple quietly thanked me for keeping the bridge open. A father standing beside a school bus stop removed his HOA cap and simply nodded. Even the utility supervisor waiting nearby walked over and shook my hand. Denise remained standing beside the empty trailer while board members quietly removed the last laminated notices from both entrances. Nobody argued anymore. Nobody applauded either. The silence carried more weight than celebration ever could. Before leaving, Sheriff Dalton addressed the residents one final time. Property records exist for a reason, he said. Communities work best when authority stays within the limits the law actually gives it. Then he turned toward me. Mr. Carter, the bridge remains exactly where it has always been. I looked across the cedar deck my grandfather built nearly 50 years earlier. Nothing about it had changed. The wood, the river, the old bronze marker, even the weathered railings all looked exactly the same. The only thing that had disappeared was the illusion that confidence could replace ownership. As the last contractor drove away with the unused steel gate, Denise Holloway stood alone beside the empty gravel shoulder. Watching the very bridge she had tried to control remain precisely what it had always been, a privately owned crossing that an entire community depended on, but could never claim. Life became quiet again much faster than I expected. Within a week, the temporary court order became a permanent settlement after the HOA formally withdrew every complaint, every violation notice, and every claim of authority over the bridge. The association's insurance carrier reportedly insisted the board resolve the matter before creating even greater liability. Richard Fallon sent Claire a brief letter confirming that Willow Creek Estates recognized the recorded property boundaries exactly as they had existed for decades. There were no dramatic speeches, no appeals, no last-minute surprises, just signatures placed where signatures belonged. Denise Holloway resigned as HOA president less than a month later. I never heard anyone celebrate it. Most residents seemed less interested in blaming one person than in making sure the same mistake never happened again. A new board was elected that autumn. One of its first decisions was surprisingly simple. Instead of trying to regulate the bridge, they asked whether the association could contribute voluntarily toward long-term maintenance costs. It wasn't a demand. It wasn't a condition. It was a respectful request. I accepted, not because I needed the money, but because neighbors working together always seemed better than neighbors arguing over paperwork. Every agreement was put in writing, reviewed by Claire, and recorded with the county so future board members would never have to guess where authority ended. And cooperation began. The bridge remained exactly what my grandfather intended it to be, privately owned, carefully maintained, and open to the community through mutual respect rather than assumed control. Every spring, I still walked the cedar deck with a wrench in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other, checking bolts, railings, and support beams the same way my father had taught me years ago. Some habits are worth keeping simply because they remind you where you came from. School buses continued crossing every weekday morning. Utility crews still waved as they drove past after storms. Ambulances, fire engines, and sheriff's deputies used the bridge whenever duty called. Nothing about daily life changed for the people living in Willow Creek Estates. The only difference was that everyone now understood why the bridge existed and who had quietly protected it all those years. Sometimes, on calm evenings, I still sit on the old wooden bench overlooking the river where Emily and I used to watch the sunset. The cedar rails have weathered a little more since then, and the current still carries fallen leaves downstream every autumn just as it always has. Standing there now, I often think about something my grandfather said after the bridge first opened nearly 50 years ago. Strong bridges don't just connect land, he told me. They connect people who choose to trust each other. For a while, That trust had been forgotten beneath assumptions and misplaced authority. Thankfully, the paperwork reminded everyone of the truth before anything truly valuable was lost. In the end, no one remembered who shouted the loudest on the bridge that morning. They remembered something much simpler. Ownership isn't proven by confidence. It is proven by responsibility. And responsibility, when carried honestly through generations, has a way of protecting far more than property. It protects the people who call that place home.